Díomh agus fáilte arás to the Crazy House Prices podcast, a podcast where I help you buy your own home, understand the madness of the Irish housing market and figure out what needs to change. I'm your host, Ciarán Mulqueen, and today's episode, which is number 40, is about something a lot of people message me about but often don't feel like they can talk openly about it, and that's the emotional and mental toll of the housing crisis. So if you're stuck renting, living at home in your 30s or 40s, unsure if you'll ever be able to afford a place, or thinking about emigrating, then this episode is for you. I want to be clear before we begin, I am absolutely not a mental health professional. In fact, I've been very lucky with my own mental health. I've always been fine, and a lot of people I know aren't that lucky. So I've been really keen to speak with someone who is actually qualified to give you proper advice. I think there are too many unqualified people online giving mental health advice, and I just think it's too serious a topic for that. So while nothing in this episode is medical advice, I'm speaking to someone who is a qualified therapist with decades of experience. So Ann Bracken is a psychotherapist who has both lived through the stress of renting, including being given a month's notice while raising 2 children, and has worked with people for years to help them manage anxiety, overwhelm and burnout. So she explains how constant housing stress affects your nervous system and what you can do about it. So we'll talk about why you feel stuck or hopeless and how to break that cycle, how stress affects your body, sleep, mood and relationships, and simple tools and strategies that you can use right now to feel more in control. So this episode isn't about blaming anyone, especially not yourself. It's about understanding what this crisis is actually doing to people and how to protect your mental health even when things feel out of your hands. So let's get into it. Now, today I have Ann Bracken with me. Thank you so much, Ann, for coming on to the podcast.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I just introduced you a bit there in the intro, but obviously you've a huge amount of experience with this. So I thought maybe we'd start with the basics, like what happens to people when their most kind of basic needs like housing or stability aren't being met?
Well, it automatically puts us into that fight or flight or freeze mode, mostly because if we look at our needs, I mean, our basic needs are a roof over our head and food, right? So in terms of, the understanding of that, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we would know to be when are we kind of at our best, when are we at our worst, under the most pressure. Maslow's hierarchy of needs starts with a roof over our head and food. So if that basic need is not being met, we're likely a lot of the time or regularly to go into survival mode. And that means that it kind of overrides our emotional center and it triggers that kind of reactive survival mode of fight, flight, freeze, which influences our psychological well-being. It influences our emotional sense of balance, and it influences our ability, interestingly, to connect to others. Because when we're in that fight, flight, freeze mode, we're unable to it's much harder to access oxytocin, which is our bonding hormone, because our pituitary gland basically prioritize stress hormones into our system, and that suppresses the ability to feel that sense of connection. So understandably then it impacts on our mood and our relationships with others as well, biologically.
Maslow's hierarchy needs bring me back to my college days a long time ago. But so mentioning that then, how relevant is that then for, say, renters, people who are kind of at the moment anyway, until March when the new laws come in, but basically at risk of being made homeless at any point. So how does that kind of impact them, do you think?
Well, I have, many people, and then plenty of others don't have the experience. But I have the experience of having rented for years. Fortunately, I'm not in that position now, thankfully. But I remember doing up a garden and, being delighted with myself because I generally created each rental home as a home. So as many people do, because you want to feel at home. And I remember doing up the garden and then literally getting permission from the landlord to do the garden up, paying out loads of money. And the following day when the garden was done, the landlord, who was a solicitor, came to the door and gave us a month's notice. Now, I remember that, and my kids were in school, 2 kids in school, and the fear that triggers. So you automatically, as a parent, step into, how do I protect my children? How do I protect my lifestyle? How do I protect my work? All of the things that this impacts on. Well, naturally that leads to psychological, emotional escalation, and our nervous system takes over. So we come outside of our zone, very often come outside of the zone of what is manageable for us to manage emotionally, psychologically, relationally. And we go into hyper focus, hyper vigilance, anxiety. So ruminating, overthinking, hypothetical worries, as well as real worries. So this compounding effect, which essentially means we can't concentrate on our tasks in front of us, and also very reactive, because fight, flight, freeze, our system takes over. We become sabotaged by our system, and therefore can become very reactive. So yeah, I remember that same landlord saying to me, "Can you return the Lego that was in the attic when I cleared the house?" And the Lego in the attic was for their children who were 21 and something else. So I literally got a black bin bag full of Lego, including the Lego of my children, and delivered it to, the workplace of this woman who kept hassling me, as well as the stress they were hassling me around moving out and terms, and when they couldn't get me on anything, it was down to Lego. So it's very, very triggering, and it's about being mindful, aware of, I'm really triggered. What can I do to support myself?
That's horrendous. Like, why even give you the permission to do the garden knowing that they're going to evict you the next day? It's awful. So, like, as you said there, you had kids, and I'm a teacher, so I see this all the time, and I think we often overlook the long-term impact it has on children to not have that stability, and I think the stress of their parents, I'm sure children can kind of pick up on that as well. So that can impact them for the rest of their life, I'm sure. So you mentioned there, like, a kind of that level of stress. So some of the signs then you mentioned, so some of the signs that people might be stuck in this kind of stress state without realizing it, is that lying awake at night overthinking things, hypothetical things? Is it kind of like I don't know, doom scrolling on their phone? Like, what are those kind of signs that people could look out for?
Well, it's a real sense of difficulty relaxing, ruminating, so constant thoughts, so like circular thoughts, basically catastrophizing thoughts, so and all or nothing thinking. So the type of thinking is like overgeneralizing. It's always going to be like this. We're never going to get out of this cycle. And then naturally we tend to want to find the source of the issue. And that can, in a relationship, can mean over focusing on our partner and saying, generalizing about the other person or because of the situation. So some of these things are outside of our control. But we often over personalize it. So it could be self-shaming, self-blaming, other shaming, other blaming. So, this is because of me. I've always been the same. I've never been able to, create a safe home or whatever, so there could be real self-shaming and emotional shutdown, low mood, depression, or the opposite. So hyper, aroused, anxious state, and then so unable to relax, unable to sit still, constantly thinking, constantly ruminating, feeling very agitated in the body, like almost like you'd want to run away. And actually these things have a physical impact as well as a psychological impact. So once those, we're supposed to get stressed occasionally, not live in heightened states of stress more than relaxation. And therefore our immune system gets compromised. So we're our blood cells, our type A blood cells get compromised, our immune system. And so we're less able to fight off infection, or we can get more serious issues. Our heart rate goes up. I often say to people, ask your watch how you feel about, things that are happening, because it'll show you, heightened heart rate, really bad for our hormones, our stress hormones releasing all the time. Therefore, difficulty sleeping, either getting asleep or staying asleep. And relationally, as I said, people feel under a huge pressure. You can't stay present to, listening to your child's needs. What are they saying about a fun day at school? Because you're not feeling relaxed. You're kind of hyper focused, feeling agitated. So much more on the move, because basically this state takes over. And it's supposed to be a state where we're kind of running away from bears, not trying to manage landlords and impossible situations, which don't seem to be alleviating, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Lots of talk from politicians, but, not enough action. And maybe it's because many of them have second houses, as we've seen, So, yeah, there are some things we can do to kind of empower ourselves a little bit more on that one. But yeah, the system can take over. So it's really important, first of all, to recognize when that has happened.
Yeah, so recognizing what the triggers are, I guess, and things like that. So a lot of people I hear from are what we've spoken about, like renters who are constantly living in that state of fear of being evicted. But then also I hear a lot from people in their 30s and their 40s who are still living at home and have that kind of feeling of guilt or shame about still living at home. And then you get other people that will say, well, I wish I was lucky to be even able to have that option to live at home. So how does that kind of affect someone's maybe their sense of self-worth, or is there anything they can do to try and, I don't know, I guess we'll talk a bit about strategies and tools, but is there anything that they can do to maybe kind of shift their mindset there?
I think, the thing about it is to recognize what's in our control. What do we have some influence of control over? And what do we have no control over? So in a kind of societal capacity, we have some influence of control, but very little over the rental market. It's not something we've called. So it's important that we don't over personalize the level of responsibility that we have. We don't say it's because of me, I'm a loser, or I should be able to do the, over personalizing, or the other person, our partner, not self-blaming or other blaming is the first thing. To recognize that this is bigger than ourselves. And, finding our voice. So, I come from a generation of people that really used to, we didn't have Facebook, so we didn't just like something or say something when we're angry on Facebook. We literally went out and marched against, And I think having a voice when we feel disempowered is really important, because otherwise we can feel hopeless and helpless, which are both the ingredients of depression. So it's really important to feel a bit more empowered. And how do we do that? It can feel, that we have no power, but when people come together, they do have an influence. So politicians are supposed to represent us. Many of them have their own agenda in relation to keeping the situation the way it is, because they often profit from it themselves because they've second houses that they rent out. However, it's really important that they are lobbied to do the job that they're actually paid to do. And that also means that you have a voice. You are in some way expressing the frustration, the distress that this is causing you and your family. And, it's important that we vote. It's important that we lobby our politicians, that you continue to write to them, that you continue to, when they call to the door, that you have a voice. Because when we do that, we feel slightly more empowered. If we feel silenced, shut down, in a state of distress, that we have no communication, no voice, then actually that's the ingredients for, emotional shutdown, numbness, disempowerment, and depression, to be honest.
It's really good advice, because it's something I'm always trying to get people to do, especially in the run up to a general election. Even before the last one, I put out a document that people could download, which kind of outlined all the issues with housing and with renting and questions, not in a confrontational way, but just questions to whichever politician. I gave a list of, if they're in a government party or if they're in opposition or an independent, questions to ask them based on where they are. And as you said, that can give people a little bit of a voice, or at least they can express how they're feeling to somebody that maybe is a decision maker or a policy maker. So really good advice there. Thank you for that. What about kind of strategies and tools then? Is there anything that people can do every day, or what advice would you give to people to try and maybe help them cope with this feeling of feeling helpless, or not having a voice, or feeling like I'm never going to be able to get my own home here, I just want to emigrate? Like, what kind of advice would you have for people on that in terms of strategies and tools?
The thing is, it's about, as I said, the first thing is to write down three different things. What's in our control? One kind of margin. What do I have some influence of control over? And what do I have no control over? Because very often we merge that whole thing and then self-blame. So that helps kind of go, okay, I have some influence of control here, like I said, trying to hold politicians a bit more accountable, so they don't, these policies that don't support housing, like, allowing foreign investors to invest without any issue, and therefore pushing house prices up, and all of those policies that actually don't help. So looking up, informing oneself about, okay, what are the facts about the housing situation at the moment, and where do I have a voice in that, and how can I express this voice? That can help. We saw that recently, in presidential election. We saw that people have a voice when they've had enough of people, landlord behaving in certain ways. So it's important to use that voice. That'll be more empowering. That's what I'd say. Some influence of control. Where do you have no control? If you're in a situation at the moment where a landlord has given you notice, you take action and then you let go. The kind of hyper thinking through, hypothetical, that actually is emotionally exhausting. So you say, okay, where can I take action and where can I let go? Like self-blaming is really mentally exhausting. Blaming our partner, mentally exhausting, relationally exhausting. So that is, and then also, where do you have an influence of control? What choices? Very often in these situations, we think we have zero choice. And what I'd say is, imagine you have a magic wand, right? And it's not about changing another person, by the way. But with this magic wand, you're saying, okay, what are the choices? What would I like it to be? How would I like it to be? What am I trying to create here? Because we get stuck in a particular, it must be, I live here in this environment in this way. And sometimes we have to actually go, okay, ideally. And that's difficult because we have a vision of how we want our life to be. And it's important that we don't think it's forever, like ideally, hopefully it's not. But what choices do I have? What have other people done in this situation? Do I have any choices? And it doesn't mean that you make the decision. Just allow yourself to be creative around those choices. And without saying, just being creative around, okay, we could try this, or we could try that, or we could explore this option, or be mindful of all or nothing. I am not going to do this because it should be this way. If we think, in that kind of way, it limits us being able to potentially come up with some type of solutions to a very difficult situation.
You're probably overpaying for your mortgage protection. Now, I'm not, because I use Beat the Bank and I've been dealing with them for years. They're an Irish company, and in a world where most companies in the home buying process are out for themselves, it's refreshing to have one that genuinely cares about you. As cliche as that sounds, but they really do. So how they work is they check the main insurers, they match the best price, and then they take more off. It's quick, it's online, and they handle all the paperwork. They also do income protection, life insurance, and soon they'll be doing home insurance, car insurance, even pet insurance. So www.beatthebank.ie to get a quote in seconds.
Yeah, so trying to let go of the things that are outside your control and focus on the things that are in your control, I guess. When we were chatting before this, you mentioned something called a window of tolerance. Could you maybe explain what that is and maybe how people can use it in everyday life?
Sure. The window of tolerance is listening to your nerves. So for example, if you're living at home with parents and you have a good relationship, a healthy relationship with your parents, then that's probably a good option to support you to save for, so that gives you maybe some choices for the future. So it's short-term discomfort, long-term comfort, right? So that's what increases our resilience. That gives us high frustration tolerance. Low frustration tolerance is where we go, I can't stand living with my parents every day, start your day. Can't stand it, shouldn't have to do this. And that leads to low frustration tolerance, right? So you kind of go, okay, low LFT, HFT, high frustration tolerance, because it's worth it for me to do that, or for us to do that. And that gives you resilience. However, if you're in a toxic situation and your nervous system is being triggered all the time, then you're outside your window of tolerance. So window of tolerance is that feeling of there's stressful situations coming in every now and again, but you can manage it. Outside of window of tolerance means we're overwhelmed. We can't think straight. We can't come up with solutions. We feel emotionally overwhelmed to an anxious state, or we feel shut down, emotionally shut down. So we're in this hypo-arousal state or hyper-arousal state. We're talking very fast, rushing around, can't sit still, hyper-arousal, outside of our nervous system management space window of tolerance, or hypo, shut down, disengaged, no fulfillment in life, emotionally numbed out, kind of feeling blah and getting through every day, but not really inspired or feeling connected. So both those situations are outside of our window of tolerance. And window of tolerance is where stressors come and go. We can manage because we're resourced. And how do we resource ourselves? Well, think of things that where you're in your zone, where you feel a sense of fulfillment. And they don't always have to be like, oh yeah, when I was on holidays for 2 weeks in such and such. You can say, well, how can I create mini spaces? And that can be walking in the woods and feeling grounded, playing with your children and feeling present, listening to particular music, switching things off and doing a mindfulness meditation. So literally giving yourself headspace away from overthinking and trying to be solution focused, giving yourself headspace, and also physiological space. So being aware of what are my triggers. Aside from landlords, there'll be people in your life that are triggers that trigger you into hypoarousal. And if that's people you're living with, like if you are living with family, extended family, and if those relationships are toxic, then it's really not good for you. Actually, it's better to live in, miles away from that situation and commute than live in a constant pressurized just because you've got friends where it's working out. So it's really about looking at your environment and saying gains and losses. What are the short-term and long-term gains and losses of staying in this environment, in this space? And do we have any choice? And it might be that we have to make a choice to move out further and commute in. Things like that. Just looking at, are these healthy relationships around me? And is it worth it for me to be here? In terms of my emotional, psychological health, relational health, if possible, to look at those things as well.
So if people could maybe try and find outlets that make them feel a little bit better about everything. Often exercise is a good one for that, I think, for most people. And you mentioned resilience there. It's interesting because I'm a primary school teacher, and we do a program with kids called Weaving Wellbeing. And every year I do, I'm often thinking, geez, there's a lot of adults that could do with this, because we're teaching them tools of resilience from a young age, how to deal with the daily life kind of ups and downs. So is there any things that maybe adults that are listening to this could maybe do that could give them small things they could do daily or weekly that would help them build maybe a resilience in those kind of situations?
Well, yeah, you're completely correct, by the way. We didn't have that emotional, relational education, let's say. It's amazing and it's really helpful because, of course, that's what we need, right? So as well as the functional aspects of education, we need those emotional, relational aspects. That's how we function in life. Not just on knowledge, but also on relationships and how we engage with the world and the lens with which we see it. So writing down a list of things that allow you to feel connected, allow you to feel, so the zone in terms of window of tolerance, it's in our parasympathetic nervous system. So how do we elicit that sense of relaxation response or flow? So it doesn't mean that, you're feeling like a Zen Buddhist monk all the time, but more that you're feeling connected, you're curious, you want to go out and meet people, you're interested in life, but you're not running around from one place to the next trying to keep yourself overstimulated, which is a little bit of hyper vigilance, but more of that sense of flow, that sense of being connected. Who are you likely to be around? What are you likely to be doing? And as you said, exercise is really helpful. And there needs to be two different types of exercise. Exercise so that you can clear the mind. So maybe, something that's cardio focused, but also exercise that allows you to unify the mind with the body and breath work. So something like, I'm biased here, put my hand up. I absolutely believe in yoga as a way of moving the stress out of the body. And also allowing the mind to balance up a little bit more with the body so that we're less overthinking or distressed and more in the body. So, anything like Tai Chi, anything that's going to bring both breath work, which elicits the relaxation response, the parasympathetic nervous system, anything that's going to elicit that, there's certain things that do that. So the opposite to fight, flight, freeze. So fight, flight, freeze, reactive, sympathetic nervous system. We have that to survive. Unfortunately, lots of us are living in that state and kind of more than we're living in parasympathetic nervous system, which allows our body and our mind to come back to balance, homeostasis. And so we do need to counteract that. And what are the things that allow that? Well, the thing we have about cold water swimming, that's essentially because we elicit the relaxation response. So it's toning the vagus nerve. Other things that do that naturally are singing, humming. So people who do some kind of chanting meditation will find that they experience that. Any kind of body movement that combines body movement with breath work, focused breath work, or meditation. So find your, not everybody is going to, be a yogi, or not everybody's going to be a Tai Chi master, but find the one that works for you. And some people think, oh, and I hate sitting doing mindfulness. It just really agitates me. The thing about that is that could be because you're ramped up in terms of your nervous system. So it is a practice. That's why all of these things are called a practice, because we need to practice. Just like we need to practice changing our narrative. We need to practice coming back out of that mind that says, oh my God, I have to be the fixer, into connection. And that's practice, practice, practice. And we often get pulled out of practice, and that's okay. We're human. And also being mindful of what you're doing to try and de-stress that's unhealthy. So it could be that people are turning to alcohol, or that they're turning to being so busy that they can't feel, noticing, are there habits that you've got into which you're trying to regulate with, you're trying to regulate your emotional system with, that are actually unhelpful. So, that are adding to that internal distress. And it's being honest with yourself about that, and really embracing as best as you can some change around that as well. Not least because it'll give you clarity of mind to come up with some, hopefully, solutions, if you can, in the situation that you're in.
That's really, as you're speaking there, it's really good advice. As you're speaking there, I'm thinking of my own list. I'm thinking, well, what things do I do naturally that I know always make me feel a little bit better? Because like a lot of my day is spent on Instagram, on my phone, which is obviously a bad start. And on Instagram, and a lot of my day is spent just in my DMs, in my inbox. And it's very often heavy stuff. People are really struggling. So become this sort of kind of agony uncle for this. So I'm reading a lot of this really dark stuff, really tough stuff. So I find that getting rid of the phone, if I just put the phone away for a couple of hours and play with the kids or whatever, I always feel better about that. Another thing I was just thinking on my list there would be like, if I get out and do a bit of gardening, I always feel better after that. And I'm an absolutely terrible gardener, but even if it's just, cutting a hedge or cutting the grass, I always feel better after that. Obviously going to the gym and stuff, I always feel better after that. And you mentioned the yoga and stuff. I probably am that type of person that I would struggle with that, with meditation and with yoga. I probably need something a bit more, a bit heavier for me. It's just what I'm used to, or getting out, exercising, spending time with my family as well. Obviously, always helps. So I guess what you're saying is what people could do right now is just write down that list of what they know tends to make them feel a bit better. Maybe not checking the phone first thing in the morning, I think, is always good advice as well. Because I'm definitely guilty of that, looking at my emails or work emails, whatever, first thing, and then your day obviously starts off on a negative then. So is that kind of what somebody could do right now to try and help them feel a bit better, is writing down that list of what makes them feel better, and then, as you said, being aware of what's an unhealthy way of dealing with the stress that they're being in. Like overworking is probably something I'm guilty of as well, and I'd say a lot of people are.
Those unhealthy, what do we do when we're feeling triggered? What do we do with that extra energy, the stress energy? And you're right. These are habit forming things, right? So really interesting. In places like France, after 5:00, there's no way that you're going to get work message or email. And so you get into the habit of not sending emails or texts in those ways. Right? However, in places like Ireland, we were top of the Europe, in the whole of Europe during COVID. We were actually working more than any other country because of our online work. Which is brilliant. We're very resourceful. Remember that. We're very resilient people. However, what that did was it put us into this always on mode. And that habit has to change. You have to establish your own boundaries, because other people are not going to establish them for you. And what does that mean? It means like saying to yourself, well, do I feel better or worse when I'm on engaging with Instagram? Very often what we do is compare and despair. So, if we're looking at people through a filter. They're not putting up, oh, geez, I just have an argument with my husband and I'm fed up now and I'm going into work. They're not putting that up. They're going, look at my glamorous, fabulous life.
Yeah.
And so we very often compare ourselves down. So just be mindful that limiting the exposure to that. And also asking yourself, what do I charge up on? What do I plug into? What does my algorithm plug into? How do I plug out? And we're not meant to take on all of that responsibility. So, for example, we're not meant to take on all of the responsibility of, everybody's process. We can't do that. We don't have that capacity. So, for example, therefore, we need to say, okay, that whole thing, put my own mask on. You support as best as you can. And you say, right, otherwise we get things like vicarious trauma, or we feel absolutely overwhelmed with what's going on in the world and feel we have no capacity to any change. So it's about, what can I do, and what can I do to look after myself, and what can I do to look after me, my family, and myself, beginning with that, not in a narcissistic way, but in a not self-centered, but centered on self way. And once you start your day with something like meditation, even though you might struggle with it, something that, grounds you, you're much more likely then to approach your work in a balanced way and not go, if we start our work with busy, that sets us up for really being exhausted, to be honest.
Yeah. And overwhelmed. Yeah.
Overwhelmed. Yeah.
So if someone is listening to this then and they're feeling overwhelmed, what's kind of one thing that you'd want them to take away from today's conversation?
That we do have choices, although it can feel like we really don't. And it's important to look at self-care as a really important, not a luxury thing. And it doesn't have to be an expensive thing, but taking care of our own, think of it like nervous system, taking care of our nervous system with self-supportive practices will allow us to have the resilience and mental capacity to explore what choices we have and to move forward with them with more energy than if we start our day from a place of distress and then increase that. We're overwhelmed. We live in overwhelm then, which is not good for us psychologically, emotionally, or physically.
Okay, that is brilliant, Anne. You've given some really good advice there over the last half an hour. I really appreciate you taking the time out to give us some tips and advice.
No problem. I was pleased to do it because I've been that person and I know how it is, and it's really bloody difficult. And you meet some amazing people along the way. So I understand this. So I was really glad to do something small to contribute in some way.
Agus sin é le haid an episode seo of the Crazy House Prices podcast. I know today's topic was a little bit different, but judging by the messages I get every week, it's one that was really needed to be talked about. Housing stress is very, very real. So some quick takeaways from today's chat with Ann Bracken. You're not imagining it. This level of stress is very real and it's very valid. So focus on what's in your control. Not everything is, and that's not your fault. Create a short list of things that genuinely help you feel calm or connected, and even really small things matter. Watch for burnout signs and be honest with yourself about what helps and what doesn't. And you don't need to do it all alone. So talking, journaling, exercising, even just switching off for a while can really help. You can read more about Anne's work or keep an eye on future training and resources at annbrackentherapy.com. And if you found this helpful, feel free to send it to a friend or someone you know who's struggling at the moment. And if you have any thoughts, my inbox is always open. If you want to support what I do here and get access to bonus Q&As, you can join my Patreon. It's just €3 a month and it helps keep the podcast going, the Instagram page going, and gives you exclusive access to my housing community to ask questions. And of course, my book, How to Buy a Home in Ireland, that's available nationwide, or even better, just borrow it from your local library for free. Anyway, thank you for listening. Slán go fóill.